Welcome to Prot Academy, the online academy for all of your risk management training needs. And welcome to the Risk Management Fundamentals for Everyone, a course aimed at equipping you with the knowledge, the skills, and particularly the practical capability to effectively help you manage the risks of your organisation. Hi, I'm David Tatham, and together with my colleagues Hila and Michael, we will be guiding you through this course. The objectives of the course are aimed at asking 5 really key questions of risk management. These questions are why, who, what, how, and when. Firstly, why does your organisation, and specifically you, need to do risk management? What is the value add for both you and your organisation? Secondly, who is responsible for risk management across your organisation? Well, obviously you, because that's why you're here, but also very importantly, the principle that everyone is a risk manager, every one of your colleagues. But what specific roles do you and they have? Thirdly, what? We cannot manage what we don't understand. What is a risk? What is not a risk? What is a control? What is not a control? So that you intimately understand what you are being required to manage. We then move on, fourthly, to how. How should your organisation, and particularly you, be managing risk? We manage risk both informally and formally. We rely heavily on your informal approach to risk management, the risk management you are doing every day without thinking about it. Also understand more formally how your organisation manages its risk and what role you play in that part. And finally, when? When should you do risk management? Is it once a year, once a month, or should it be more frequently? This training will be delivered across 6 lessons. Each lesson consisting with 1 or more short videos together with exercises, case studies and practice aids. At the end of each lesson, there will be a short knowledge test to reinforce learning, and at the end of the course, there will be a final knowledge assessment. So let's get into it. So firstly, the why. Why would you be interested in doing risk management? Why does your organisation need to practice risk management? Well, typically people think about risk quite negatively. Risk is bad, risk is danger, risk causes you problems. And let's be honest, risk managers are boring, dull. They stop you having fun, the business prevention unit, unnecessary overhead. I'm sure many of you feel that way, so you're probably not feeling overly engaged in the process of risk management. The problem with this perception is it's incorrect. We need to flip it to think about what risk management really is. Our international standard ISO 31000 defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. The most important word for you to think about is objectives, because it means that risk management is managing the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Let's think about an activity for you in your personal life, perhaps travelling to work in a motor vehicle. From the time you are asleep to the time you're at your desk, what are the risks you have to deal with? Well, firstly, what is the objective? I would say the objectives for you are to get to work by a certain time, to get there safely, to get there at a reasonable cost, to get there in good condition, and hopefully to comply with the road rules. These are your objectives. We then think about what are the things that could impact on those objectives. The first one I can think of is the risk of oversleeping. So if you oversleep, The chance of you getting to work on time is now being compromised. It's created uncertainty. And I think it's fairly obvious what could happen to you from a value perspective. If you keep getting to work late, you might find yourself without a job. As a result, the risk of oversleeping has a direct impact on the objective of you getting to work on time. Risk management is managing the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So if we now think about why risk management is valuable, it's valuable because risk management is outcome management. It should be called objectives or outcome management. And who of you would not want to manage your objectives better? That is what's in it for your organization, and that's what's in it for you.
Now that we've talked about the why of risk management, we're going to talk about the who. You've probably guessed it already, but we are all risk managers. That includes you. So let's talk about risk management in your life. So I'm going to use an example here. Let's say that you've got an objective of getting to work on time. Now, being a good risk manager, you're not going to jump into the car and pull out policy and procedure documents to read them. More than likely, you're going to inherently know what you've got to do, grab your seatbelt, put on the right radio station, and head to work. Something happens, though, when we all come together to manage risk as a collective of people. For whatever reason, we might decide, oh, I don't need to manage this risk. There might be somebody else looking after this risk for me. So as a collective, we sometimes really do forget how to manage risk. As a result, we need to have policies and procedures in place. We need to have accountability for roles across the organization in managing risk. We need to be able to track and report on a consistent basis across our risks in an organization. So, in risk management, we all have a role to play. In some organizations, you might see that some teams have got the title of risk management. Although we are all responsible for managing the risks in our environment, there may be specific roles that have accountabilities for certain aspects of risk management. So what's commonly known as the 3 lines of defense model. You'll have your first line, which is all employees across the organization who are working together to manage risks on a daily basis. You then might have some teams that have got the title of risk management or risk in their title. They're generally there to provide additional support and guidance, provide you with frameworks and opportunities to manage risk in an effective manner. You might also then have independent parties that come in and have a look at how risks are being managed and provide some additional advice. It's commonly what we refer to as the 3 lines of defense model. So coming back to the who, we are all accountable for risk management. Although you might have someone in the organization who has the title of risk, we don't want to become Teflon risk managers, where we say, I'm going to resort to somebody else managing that risk for me. We need to take accountability. If I go back to the example of driving your car to work, pretty sure you're going to be responsible for the speed in which you drive to work for. You won't necessarily have a risk manager sitting in the car saying you really shouldn't go over the speed limit. So now that we've talked about the who of risk management, we're going to get into the what of actually managing risks for you and for your organization.
So thirdly, we're now going to look at what it is we are asking you to manage. We cannot manage what we don't understand, so we're going to have a look at what are risks and what are controls. So firstly, what are risks? Ask 10 different people what risk is, and they'll often give you a different answer. It's not an easy concept. Let's take a look. Firstly, risk is not a single word. It's not a single sentence. It's not even a single paragraph. It is a story. And like any story, risk has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. Let's take an example of you driving to work. The risk of oversleeping. Now, we would generally call that risk oversleeping risk, and it's the point in our story where things have started to go wrong. I sometimes use the word the point in your day when things went pear-shaped, meaning they've gone or starting to go wrong. Now, if we take that as when things started to go wrong, we now need to ask, but why did you oversleep? And it could go all the way back to going to bed too late the night before, maybe partaking in too much partying the night before, or maybe you have a sickness, an illness that is making you more tired. There could be several reasons. These are what we call the root causes of the risk, where the story started. This then dominoes through to the point that you oversleep. Now we've overslept, we now need to think about how that connects with our objective. So we oversleep, so we get up too late, so now we end up getting late to work, which was one of our objectives. Now this can be illustrated using a simple diagram. Here is an example. In risk management, we call this risk bow tie analysis for obvious reasons. This is a really neat, simple way to get a better understanding of the risks you face. Risk is therefore made up of causes, risk events, and risk impacts on your objectives. Secondly, let's look at controls. What are controls? Controls are aimed at reducing the size of the risk you face. The size of a risk is generally identified as a combination of the likelihood of the risk event occurring and the size of impact on your objectives if it were to occur. Now, if we think about an example of driving to work and the risk of oversleeping, what would a typical control be? Yes, the alarm clock. Now, the alarm clock is aimed at reducing the likelihood of you oversleeping, not the impact. And this is an example of a preventive control. It prevents or reduces the likelihood of the risk event occurring. Now we're driving to work. One of the risks that we could face differently from oversleeping is running out of gas, running out of fuel. What do we have there as a control? A fuel gauge, a gas gauge. This is known as a detective control, and it detects that a risk is developing. And hopefully if it detects early enough, we can pull into a gas station, a petrol station, to be able to rectify that problem. And finally, what about if our car breaks down? We have now had an event occur. We're now trying to minimize the impact, and perhaps we could use an Uber. An Uber would be what we call a corrective, sometimes known as a reactive control, and its aim is to reduce the impact from that risk occurring. This gives then rise to what we call likelihood reducing controls, which are preventive and early detective, and impact reducing controls, late detective and corrective reactive. Now we should be aiming for reducing the likelihood before we reduce the impact. Why? Because prevention is better than cure. In your role, always be looking out for how can you prevent a risk occurring rather than waiting till it's happened and then managing the impact. Be proactive, not reactive.
So you're all fired up on the why of risk management, and now you understand the components of risk. So how do you go about managing risk? Well, the good news is you already are a great risk manager. You manage risk every day. Think about that cup of coffee that you push away from the edge of a bench, the Lego that you pick up so you don't stab your foot, or crossing the road and looking left, looking right. You are already a great risk manager. The best risk management system is the informal one that's between your ears. Now, your organisation might also have more formal risk management processes, but it follows many of the same concepts and processes. Now, you may have heard some risk buzzwords in your organisation. As a risk manager, I can certainly say I'm guilty of using them. But we can use plain language to manage our risks. And these are the things that you would do every day. I'm going to take you through a few steps in plain language that you would use to manage risks. Firstly, what are you trying to achieve? What could potentially go wrong or prevent you from achieving that? How bad could that be? And are you okay with that? If not, what might you do about it? How are you going to monitor or measure? What will you do if things go wrong or things go bad? These are common risk concepts that can be applied in an organisation as well as to your personal life. You do them subconsciously, and they're also done in your organisation. Sometimes with a bit more process, and yes, some more lingo, some more risk buzzwords. We'll provide you a cheat sheet so that you can match that plain language to the buzzwords and the risk lingo. So with that in mind, let's return to David's example he gave of arriving at work on time. So what are you trying to achieve? Exactly that, arrive at work on time. So what could go wrong? Sleeping in was one of the risks, or one of the examples of things that could potentially go wrong. Now this is essentially where David left off. These are the things that might happen. But how bad could that be? What could the potential consequences be? Now it could be that you might end up losing your job if you don't arrive on time, perhaps multiple times in a row. Now, the next question is, are you okay with that? Now I'd imagine for most of you, if not all of you, the answer is no. You are not okay with that. The next question is, what are you going to do about it? And in the previous lesson, David talked about controls that you might put in place to minimize the chance of that happening. Now, there may be some other particular things that you might want to do in order to minimize that level of risk. Perhaps on an extreme level, you might consider moving closer to the workplace. Perhaps you might change your job, or you might consider flexible working arrangements to reduce the likelihood you will arrive late to work. What assurances do you need that you will arrive at work on time? Now, in the example David provided, there was an alarm clock to help you wake up. Now, one of your assurance activities might be just to make sure that that alarm clock is definitely working when you go to sleep. Every night when I go to sleep, I'm always checking my phone to make sure that that alarm is going to go off when I thought it was going to. And finally, what will you do if things go wrong? What happens if that alarm doesn't go off or you otherwise arrive late to work? How will you manage that situation? Well, you might notify your manager in advance to let them know that you will be arriving late. All these processes that we've covered are things that you do every day, subconsciously, in all of the activities that you do. You may also be involved in some of the formal risk management processes in your organisation, possibly without even knowing it, or you might observe them in your workplace. Let's take a quick look at some of those processes. The first activity is risk assessments. These might also be called risk and control self-assessments. These may be applied at different levels of your organisation, perhaps the enterprise-wide, division, process, or activities that you might be involved in directly. The second are risk metrics. Now, risks may give off puffs of smoke or evidence that risks are in motion. As part of your role, you might collect metrics. You might not call them risk metrics or key risk indicators, but they might be indicators of risk. This might be a process that you are involved in and report those to other people. The third process is incident management. This is what we're going to do if things go wrong. Now, when they do go wrong, there may be formal processes both for you as an individual to report them, and then there are others who might be responding to that incident, doing root cause analysis, understanding why that incident occurred and what you might do about it. You may be involved in some of those root cause analysis processes. Fourth is controls assurance. Now, there may be controls in place over some of the risks that your organisation faces. There may be a need, due to the importance of those controls, for someone to kick the tyres, make sure that those controls are still working as they are intended. For example, in your organisation, you might see people walking around the office and checking your fire extinguishers, or making sure that those smoke detectors are still working. This is controls assurance. And finally, issues and actions. So from some of the activities that we have just covered, we might identify gaps or things that we need to address. In risk assessments, we might identify that a risk is outside of acceptable levels and something that we want to do something about. When we are monitoring or reporting on key risk indicators, they might be beyond thresholds that we've set, requiring some action to be taken. During incident management, we may identify some inadequate processes during root cause analysis that requires us to take some action in order to address them. And during controls assurance, we might identify controls that aren't working the way we thought they were, requiring us to remediate them or make them better. Usually, those issues and actions require some formal ownership. Perhaps there might be a requirement for some resources, financial or human, in order to rectify those issues. Ensuring that there is accountability and formal ownership ensures that those are taken seriously and that they are addressed. Now, these are some of the formal processes that may be in place in your organisation. You may be involved in some of them. These processes are typically documented in places like Word or Excel documents or in enterprise risk management systems. Let's go back to our checklist. One of the key questions that we asked was, what are we going to do about it if we aren't happy with it? Let's delve a little bit deeper into that. What can you do if there is a risk or an issue that you're not happy with? Now, one of the first things that we do is just accept the risk. There is no activity that we do that is without risk. There are some risks that we just simply have to take. If your organisation has set a particular level of risk that is acceptable, if you assess a risk within that boundary, then there is no further action that needs to be taken. It is simply accepted. Another option, which you've highlighted already, is to minimise the risk by implementing controls. Putting something in place that reduces the likelihood of the risk occurring or the impact of the risk if it were to occur. Sometimes we can re-engineer our processes, change the way that we do things so that we don't get exposed to the risk in the first place. Take, for example, crossing the road. Now, you might just be able to cross the road, which would expose you to some risk. But perhaps 10 metres down the road, there is a bridge. By changing your process, you can avoid the risks of being hit by a car altogether. In some cases, we transfer our risks, or usually some of the impact. You probably have insurance of some type on a vehicle or a home or your contents. This is an example where the risk might still occur, but you have transferred the impact to someone else. And finally, one of the options available to us is simply to avoid the risk. Now, you might be thinking, isn't that where we should start? Isn't avoiding risk a good thing? And while that makes sense on the surface, usually avoiding the risk also means avoiding the reward. We can stop crossing the road altogether if there's no bridge, but we then don't cross the road because we might be too afraid of getting hit by the car. In many cases, and particularly in our organisations, there is some level of risk we have to take. However, sometimes we might realise that the level of risk is too high or perhaps has changed and it is no longer acceptable to continue the activity that is giving rise to that high level of risk. In those circumstances, we may stop the activity that is giving rise to that risk. Now, you may not be involved in some of these more formal risk management processes, but even if you aren't, risk management is right under your nose. There may still be policies that you abide by. There may be delegations, limits in place. These are all ways to help manage risk in your organisation. Whenever you are following some of those internal policies, that is part of risk management. We'll provide you some resources below to link some of these formal risk management processes to the risks and risk management processes that you do in your day-to-day activities. Now that you understand the how of risk management, I'll hand over to David, who is going to take you through the when. When do we do risk management?
When should risk management be practiced? Now, if we think again in your personal life and your informal risk management, I don't think you would have a timetable as to when you practice it and when you don't. I think it would be embedded in everything you do. Every time you cross a road, every time you go to bed at night, setting the alarm clock, every time you drive your car, it's just part of everything that you do. So in an ideal world, we practice risk management continuously. Now, in the formal process within your organisation, that can be sometimes really difficult and take a lot of time. Therefore, your organisation may have a particular cadence, a particular time. It does various parts of risk management. For example, a risk assessment may only formally be done once every year or once every 6 months. The collection of risk information, called risk metrics, may be once a month, where incidents may be managed all the time whenever they occur. Find out what the cadence is of risk management in your organisation and make sure your contribution to that formal risk management is done on time. Now, in terms of what you're going to be involved with, is going to depend on your role. And some of you will be involved with more of the risk management process formally than others. Your role will be defined by your organisation. The key is understand why and to really get engaged. So what are the key takeaways for you in this risk fundamentals training? Firstly, redefine the way that you think about risk and risk management. Risk management is outcome management. Say risk management, think outcome management. You will then be engaged because I think we all want great outcomes. Secondly, get intimate with risk. Get to know what it is. Perhaps use that simple risk bow tie analysis diagram. Play around with it to understand the difference between a cause, an event, and an impact, and that how risk develops over its life. Remember, you cannot manage what you don't understand. Thirdly, remember that you're already an expert in risk management. Risk management training is about reminding you what you already know, to bring out those informal practices and recognize them as more formal organizational-wide practices. And fourthly, linked to the fact that you're already an expert, you will already be doing a lot of great risk management across your organization. From calling out something that you see that isn't quite right, perhaps an error, or a broken piece of infrastructure, to pushing that cup of coffee from the edge of the table to the center. This is all really great risk management. Keep doing that good work. And the key is to be able to appreciate that you're already doing a lot of great stuff. We just want you to be part of the bigger formal risk management. And finally, a really key takeaway is to think about your everyday behavior and your practices and what you do and how that can improve risk management across the organization. I'm going to call these the 10 key behaviors that you can work on and practice that supports great risk management. Number 1, if in doubt, shout it out. And this is all about the speak up culture. If you see something that looks wrong, that you just feel isn't right, don't keep quiet. We cannot manage what isn't identified and called out. Secondly, be outcome focused. Whenever you talk about risk and manage risk, think about the outcome to which it's relating to. And if you then focus on better outcomes, I'm sure you'll be more motivated. Thirdly, call out good and bad news equally. Don't be one of those people that is only willing to speak up and talk about good things, because that's not what life's like. You also need to call out the bad news as equally as the good news. The bad news often containing a lot of risk information. Fourthly, be risk aware. We sometimes use the words, have a chronic state of unease. And this means that always be looking around and being aware of risks around you. As soon as you get eased, things go wrong. Mr. T.J. Smith of the Titanic became quite eased. He had a chronic state of ease, and we all know what happened next. Number 5 is to be willing to be a challenger. Someone who's willing to challenge everybody else in the organisation when they feel something isn't right. Now, be skilled at challenging. You challenge with care, not with aggression. Number 6, on the other side of that, be open to be challenged. When you are challenged, don't become defensive. Number 7, with this discussion around challenging, some people interpret that as I don't trust them. But remember, you can trust, but you always check as well. They are not mutually exclusive, so trust and check. Number 8, be proactive in your risk management, not reactive. Don't wait for bad things to happen. Always look for ways that you can prevent them from happening. Prevention is better than cure. Number 9, don't have a blame culture. If something goes wrong, don't immediately go up to someone and go, that was your fault. Instead, go up and say, did something go wrong? How can I help you? And how can we learn from this? If you blame people, they will not call anything out and you will never know about the risk. And lastly, I want to leave you with this thought. Great risk management enables your organisation to achieve a lot more. If you think about the brakes you have on a Formula One race car, they are a control. What is the purpose of those very expensive brakes? Many of you will say to stop the car quickly, to protect the driver. But the real number 1 objective is to enable the car to go faster. Its objective is to win the race. And those brakes enable it to brake at the very last thousandths of a second into a bend. So it can be the fastest car around that track. So controls and risk management enable us to go faster safely.
I'm going to leave you with my favourite risk quote of all time, which is, a ship is safe in harbour, but that is not what ships are for. So what does that mean? If a ship only remained in harbour, we would not be able to travel to destinations across the world. We would not have goods travelling across the world to our doorstep. Now, of course, that doesn't mean there isn't risk involved. This is risk that needs to be taken in order to achieve those objectives. And all of those ships will have crew managing those ships to make sure that they arrive at their destination and they achieve their objectives. Those ships all have crew just like you. So that now brings us to the end of the course. We hope that you are now energized in how risk management can help you in both your personal life and your work life. We'll now turn to our final knowledge check. Good luck.